Here is something. There is nothing I hate more than the statement that the fantasy genre and fantasy books are just for children and they are nothing but escapism. Alright, I absolutely abhor this. Basically, snobs. But here is another statement, something that is way worse. And this one is actually much more local. This one is within our fandom. It is among fantasy fans and among fantasy authors, because a lot of people have tried to make fantasy darker. They have tried to make fantasy more adult. And here's something I heavily disagree with. And it is that to make fantasy more adult, we have to have violence, we have to have gore, we have to have, we have to have sex, and we have to have a ton of it, and a lot of scandalous behavior and swearing. And this is not the case. What makes adult is the subject matter. It's not whether you have blood or gore or violence. I do daily uploads. Please consider subscribing. By the way, in this particular video, I'm analyzing Prince of Thorns in the Broken Empire by Mark Lawrence. And this was recommended by Thomas Fiarfax, I believe that's how you say the name. You can recommend your favorite book and I will analyze it. This problem is actually extremely rampant. It is festering through Grimdark fantasy books because among Grimdark fans and among Grimdark authors is this particular excuse, and I call it an excuse because that's how I see it. It is the use of realism as an excuse for bad storytelling. At the end of the day, realism should not be used as an excuse, because a lot of the time what will happen is that character development will be excluded because realism. What will end up happening is that satisfying conclusions will be excluded because realism. And a lot of things that make stories will be excluded on the grounds of realism. Now, do I have an issue with this? You can be a fan of it, you can like it. I'm just critiquing my issue with Grimdark fantasy books. And in fact, I will be analyzing a Grimdark fantasy book that fixes the very problems I'm talking about. And another thing is that one of the issues of Grimdark is that in order to make something adult, what they believe is we have to have gore and violence and nothing more. I came across this in The Black Company. This is a Grimdark book by Glenn Cook. Well, guess what? I really DNF'd this book as well. And the reason why I DNF'd it is very much because it is trying to be adult by having violence and gore and nothing more than that. You can have that, and that in fact would make your story R-rated. But generally speaking, in my eyes, subject matter should be the first thing that makes a book adult. And Grimdark, the worst problem with Grimdark fantasy books is that they assume in order to tell a realistic story, they assume in order to tell a better story, you need violence and gore. In order to make fantasy realistic, you need violence and gore. I very much stand against this particular behavior because it pisses me off on a deep level. But a book that actually fixes this is Prince of Thorns, the first book in the Broken Empire by Mark Lawrence. Actually, I will be picking up book 2 this summer along with book 2 of Gentleman Bastards. Moving on, in this particular book, what we have is a story where, of course, it is grimdark, and it has the violence and all of those things, but on top of that, it has deep subject matter. It has what actually, in my eyes, makes a book adult, and it is the subject, the themes, the characters, and the commentary that is happening within the book. Before I went into it, a lot of people were talking about how there's a lot of in this book, and I just want to say that is a poor criticism of this book. This book, yes, it is violent, it has a lot of gore, and it might not be fit for the mainstream palette, but hey, that I think is a book criticism. While there is in this story, it is not necessarily all of the story. It's in fact a tiny portion of the beginning. A tiny portion of the beginning, like that's a major theme. A lot of people, like if you honestly, yeah, they are valid, they are there, and you can witness them, but they are minor things, and I don't think that should detract from the overall positive 5 out of 5 experience that you're going to get. Because let me tell you, this one is 5 out of 5 grimdark fantasy experience. Mark Lawrence does not shy away from what actually makes a book adult. In other words, he tackles heavy thematic subject in this particular story. He tackles themes that are really not, first of all, in the mainstream, but number two, if they are in the mainstream, he tackles them with way more depth and far more realistic intention. The story follows Jorg Ankrath, a prince, and he is the eldest son. His uncle, Renar, sends assassins to assassinate him and his mother and younger brother. Well, guess what? He survives, and his father is an asshole. Basically, that's what you have to understand about the king. The king is an asshole. And what ends up happening is that his father refuses to avenge the death of his mother and, William, the younger brother. He becomes extremely violent. If your parents, your mother specifically, and your younger brother were killed, but no one in the world will seek justice for you. Like, just imagine that. If no one will seek justice for you, who will? And this is what this book answers flawlessly in my eyes. The reason why I say this is because Jorg, when justice is refused to him, he seeks justice in this brutal world, because this is a brutal world and he will be stepped over if he is not brutal. A lot of the reasons why Jorg is very brutal, that is why, because guess what? This is a world that is post-apocalyptic. A nuclear Armageddon, a nuclear war, has actually taken us back to feudalism. It has destroyed modern civilization, and we are now back to feudalism, and it's a very brutal world that does not have mercy for the weak. And Jorg, he is refused justice, and he has to seek justice with his own hands. And I have never really seen a more beautiful take on revenge and how vengeance consumes a person and it blinds them to their flaws. Because a lot of the time, Jorg will be actually killing innocent people on his path. He's plundering and he's burning entire villages. He needs justice from a merciless world, and he has to become, therefore, merciless himself. A lot of the time, actually, I did not relate to Jorg. I understood Jorg. We will talk about that tomorrow, and how a lot of fantasy have relatable protagonists and the understandable protagonist has practically died off. This is what makes adult stories. It's not that, Mark Lawrence is writing a lot of gore. And this is what a lot of Grimdark fails to capture. A lot of Grimdark is just, oh, we need to have more realistic stories, all right? Well, we are going to have a miserable world that is going to kill everyone. That is the case. In here, it's literally a post-apocalyptic world. But on top of that, it does what I consider makes a story adult. Have a story where the author is not necessarily having a lot of gore and therefore just calling it realistic and adult. In other words, he's not using realism as an excuse for bad storytelling. In fact, he is doing the most realistic thing to tell the best depiction of revenge I have ever seen. And this is the problem with Grimdark books. And this Grimdark book fixes those problems and fixes that one major hurdle I have with Grimdark. In other words, it's not about gore, it's not about violence. If you want to have a realistic story, then have a realistic depiction of a subject matter that is not necessarily found in other stories. And that is where I think this book excels. I really, really recommend this. And in fact, I'm going to be picking up book 2 in the summer. Tomorrow, there will be much, much more spoilers. This one is a general view of sort of a skeleton, a motivation of what drives the story and what drives Jorg. Tomorrow, I will actually delve into the character of Jorg and I will analyze that. And yes, this is my biggest issue with Grimdark. A Grimdark book fixes my issue, and I hope that you enjoyed. Anyway, I do daily uploads. Please consider subscribing. Have a nice day.